Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished participants. I will now start the second topic of today for this webinar. My name is Achmad Ariefiandy from Komodo Survival Program. Our organization is work in collaboration with the National Park, Komodo National Park, and also the PBKSD NTT to research program and monitoring program and conservation activities for Komodo dragon. Today, I would like to talk about the introduction of the Komodo dragon, and later on, Mr. Tim Jessop will talk a bit more about the ecology and conservation. Komodo dragon is a reptile that belongs to Varanid family. There are more than 70 species of Varanid that can be found in Asia, Africa, and Australia. In Australia, the Varanid also called iguanas. This animal, however, cannot be found in America and Europe. In Indonesia, there are 29 species of Varanid, and we call it as biawak. One of the biggest and famous one of the biawak family is Varanus komodoensis. In Indonesia, the species is officially called as biawak komodo, the name that has given to the species based on the location when it first described on the early 19th century by P.A. Owen, the Komodo Island. People in Komodo, on the other hand, call the species as ora, and on Flores, they call it sembau, rugu, and buaya darat. The common name in English for this species is Komodo dragon or Komodo monitor. Komodo dragon is a protected species. The IUCN categorized this animal as vulnerable, and it's also listed as Appendix 1 in CITES category. Indonesian government has also protected this animal by Indonesian law, which are the Undang-Undang Nomor 5 1990 and also Peraturan Pemerintah Nomor 7 1999. Komodo dragon also a flagship species and endemic to Indonesia. Sorry. This large predator, uniquely, has a very narrow and restricted distribution area. It only can be found in the eastern part of Indonesia, the Lesser Sunda region or East Nusa Tenggara. In Nusa Tenggara Timur, Komodo dragon can be found in Komodo National Park and also on the west coast of Flores Island from the Waiwul Reserve to Karitamese Peninsula. On the northern coast, the animal can also be found in Longos Island, Wata District, Torong Padang Peninsula, and the Tree Reserve in Riau. Komodo dragon in Komodo National Park, it's slightly darker compared to those in Flores Island. If you see in these pictures, the pictures above, this is the adult, the juvenile, and the hatchling of Komodo dragon in Komodo National Park. And if you can see the pictures below, there's three pictures of dragon in Flores Island. It's a little bit brighter and more yellowish color. Like other reptile, the Komodo dragon life cycle, it started from egg. A female usually lay an average 24 eggs, with the maximum recorded is 38 eggs in a single clutch in a single breeding season, which usually once in a year. The egg will hatch usually during the end of the rainy season between February to April. When it hatches, the hatchling is very bright in color and the size is so tiny, it's only 14 centimeters in length and weight less than 100 grams. Soon after it hatches, the juvenile will slightly climb to the trees and they spend the first year of their life in the trees, prey upon insects, geckos, and bird eggs. The juvenile, even though they start to live primarily in the ground, they still spend some time of their life in the tree. Let's have a look in this graph. If you see that the black bar is the frequency used by the hatchling and the gray bar is the frequency used by the juvenile. The hatchling, they only spend probably less than 3% of their life in the trees. They only touch the ground when they move from trees to another trees. While the juvenile, they spend about 70% of their life in the tree, in the land, but they still use the trees, especially about 30% of their life, especially to avoid the predation from its conspecific larger dragon. The small dragon are quite active foraging. They hunt small mammals and snakes, and also flightless birds' eggs, such as a jungle fowl or megapod bird's egg. Komodo dragon is a solitary animal. It's very hard, or it's very rarely they're found in the groups in the wild. They reach the maturity age between 8 to 9 years old. The adult dragon frequently show fighting during the breeding season. The breeding season occurs around June and July, and soon after the mating, the female will start to prepare the nest by digging a nest chamber and some holes for decoys. She then will lay the eggs around August to September and guarding the nest until December, but a long time, for about 4 months. These activities was really hard for the female, not only effort for digging the nest, but also limiting her activities in hunting the prey. My colleague Danny observed during the one breeding season, about 4 to 5 months, the female only hunt 4 times of deer. The rest is fasting day. There are 3 types of the Komodo nest. The first one and the most frequently used is the mound nest. This nest is basically a modification from the megapod bird nest. The other nest was the hill nest and the ground nest. When the female lay the egg, sometimes the egg chamber is very deep, up to 2.5 meters deep. If you see this image, it's my colleague Danny, and we finished digging the Komodo nest after the egg hatch, and we found the remaining egg cell is just below his feet down there, and the surface of the nest is just above his raised hand. It's very deep, isn't it? When the dragon reach adult, and usually when they reach 20 kilogram or more, they already start to hunt larger mammals. They use sit or wait and ambush strategy as they become too heavy to actively forage, and also to conserve the energy. There are 3 main items or 3 ungulates that Komodo dragon usually prey on, especially for the big one. The first one is the Timor deer, the water buffalo, and the wild pig. Among these 3 ungulates, the most preferred prey item for Komodo dragon is the Timor deer. Our research shows that there are differences of body size Komodo dragon among the big island and small island. Let's have a look really close in this graph. This graph is show the percentage or the proportion of the 15% of the largest dragon in each island. The 2 big island, Komodo and Rinca, and 2 small island, Nusa Padang and Gili Muatang. In the big island, where deer they prey more abundance, the Komodo dragon tend to be bigger. The biggest dragon, or the 15% of the big dragon, usually weigh between 60 kilogram to 70 kilogram. While on the other hand, on the smaller island, where deer is more or less abundant, the heaviest dragon, or the big dragon, usually only weigh between 15 to 20 kilograms. It's very different between the big island population and the small island population. Speaking about the body size, the large adult male is very big. They could reach up 3 meters and weigh almost 100 kilograms. While the female is tend to be smaller. The adult female, the maximum size of the female that we found is only 2.4 centimeters, and we never found any dragon that weigh more than 40 kilograms. So all the female usually less than 40 kilograms. The female also live shorter. The maximum, a very healthy individual can live up to 30 years, even though most of them died before 20 years. The males live a little bit longer, up to 40 to 60 years, but most of them died before 40 years. To understand this, let's have a look at this graph again. So this is the proportion of the Komodo dragon in Komodo National Park that we identified. It's from about 400 samples. The blue bar, it shows the percentage of the proportion of the males, and the red bar is the female, and on the bottom line, the axis here is the predicted age. You can see that very few males that we estimated the age between 30 and 40. Most of them probably died around 30 years. And if you look at the female bar here, very few of them we estimate the age is 20 to 30, because most of them usually died around 20 years, and none of the female lived after 30 years. There are at least 57 species of bacteria that were identified from a collective samples, saliva sample from 39 dragons from both from wild and captive animal. Please note that this is not in a single individual, so it's from collective sample. This paper by Montgomery et al. 2002 highlighted that there are more strain bacteria that found in the wild dragon compared to those that live in captive one, suggested that the bacteria might also come from their environment. This is not surprising if you look at this image below. You see that this is the image when the dragon prey or feed upon the dead buffalo carcass in the buffalo ponds. Yeah, there must be lots of bacteria that transport from the environment to the bacteria. The thing that always surprised me is it's amazing that how Komodo dragon that have so many bacteria but without become infected by the bacteria. Again, Komodo National Park is the main distribution area for Komodo dragon. There are 5 major islands. The first and the biggest one is the Komodo Island. The second one is the Rinca Island, Padar Island, and there are 2 small islands, Nusa Kode and Gili Motang. Despite famous of 2 unique species, the Komodo dragon and the yellow-crested cockatoos, Komodo dragon is also rich. Komodo National Park, also rich in its biodiversity. It's a home for at least 18 species of mammals, 129 species of birds, 37 species of reptiles and amphibians, and the habitat, which is mainly predominantly savannas and deciduous monsoon forests, it has at least 250 species of plants or vegetation. Komodo National Park is also home for nearly 4,000 individuals or inhabitants. You see that this is the image of the Komodo village in Komodo Island, and this is the smile of the kids in Komodo village. When human and wildlife live side by side, it's often quite challenging to be able to coexist. Conflict sometimes inevitable. In the line with the discovery of numerous emerging infectious disease or AIDs that have been identified in wildlife, none has created negative public perception on wildlife for this risk. This negative perception is considered as the most important threat to wildlife conservation. This paper that wrote by Butke et al. Highlighted that to address such situation require interdisciplinary collaboration in One Health context to mitigate the risk this disease and also to promote the benefit of wildlife, which will improve the people perception. In Komodo National Park, however, the authorities has implemented One Health context approach by protecting the ecosystem and limiting the interaction. There are only less than 5% of Komodo National Park is allowed for public for visitation and also for human settlements. If you see this map, the only place that allowed for tourists to come is only the green area here. And human settlements is and the area that allowed people to activities to local people is the brown area. It's only less than 5%. The 95% of the Komodo National Park is remain undisturbed and is protected, the yellow and the red one. In sustainable ecotourism that Komodo National Park practice, the tourist or the visitor is also, they have to be guided by a ranger or the naturalist guide, and they only allowed to walk in the designated path or tourist trail. So there are no interaction between human and wildlife allowed. Through sustainable ecotourism, the park also promotes the benefit of wildlife, especially for the local community. If you see this image again, the ranger or the naturalist guide that walk to guide the tourists is people from the local communities. So this practice, I believe that this practice has improved the people perception in wildlife and biodiversity in Komodo National Park to support the conservation of Komodo dragon in this area. That was my last slide, and here are some references if you would like to know more about the ecology of Komodo dragon. The list is available on our website here, and you may contact us, and if you need to download or to want to read this article. Thank you very much. And the time I return to Sasrin.
Thank you, M.Phil, for the excellent presentation. We now understand more about Komodo today. We just know that the Komodo with higher availability of prey are bigger than the Komodo live in a place where only few prey are available. Maybe that's also similar to humans. The Dutch people are tall and big compared to Indonesian due to nutrition. Okay, back to topic. We know that the conservation of Komodo also needs the collaboration of many disciplines as the application of One Health in conservation practices. Okay, then we continue to our last session, but not least. Our third speaker today is Timothy Jessop, or Tim. I will start to share my screen to give you a brief introduction of Tim. Okay. Wait. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Tim is a senior lecturer in physiology, Faculty of Science, Deakin University, Australia. He's also a scientific advisor in Komodo Survival Program, Bali, Indonesia. And he finished his bachelor in James Cook University and continued his PhD in University of Queensland, Australia. Please welcome Tim Jessop. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Sasrin. That's very kind of you with that introduction, and thank you to the organising committee for the opportunity of speaking at whatever time it is where you are. It's a very cold 12 degrees where I am in Southern Australia at the moment. I'll just share my screen and we'll get going. All right, hopefully everyone can see this, and off we go. So Achmad gave a very lovely introduction into the biology of Komodo dragons, and I'd like to sort of continue by sort of more focusing on some of the ecology or some of the interactions that Komodo dragons have with their environment. And I really want to focus on those ones that are probably really helpful or useful to explaining why Komodo dragons have persisted for so long in what are really quite difficult environments in terms of living on often very small islands. So what is it about ecology? Well, ecology is just really one of the many components that biologists need to understand about animals to explain how they deal with environmental variation. But it's a very important aspect of the different components that allow animals to survive through very long periods of time. So in the case of the Komodo dragon, we know that it's probably lived in Indonesia for at least a million years.
Sorry to interrupt, Tim. I think you haven't share your screen.
It says share for
me.
Yeah. Am I blocked from your end at all? It says.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
No,
okay.
My fault.
Now
Sorry.
We can see.
Yeah, that would have been very interesting. My apologies for that. So, as I was saying, ecology is a really core component of several components that help explain how animals adapt to their environment and allow them to persist through time. So it's very, very important. And one of the things that we really know about animals that live on islands, they probably have it in general a bit harder than animals that we find on continents. And by that, all I'm meaning is that if you look at the extinction rates of animals, they tend to be much, much higher on islands than they are in continents. And there are a number of reasons for that, but we'll touch on some of the things that Komodo dragons do to make sure that they don't go extinct, because they have been incredibly successful. And as Achmad's already mentioned, you know, they're very, very unusual in the sense that they have a really small geographic range or a very small area in which they live. So that really poses some difficult challenges for how these animals.
Sorry, Tim, sorry to interrupt. Could you please speak up a little bit? Thank you.
Is that better? Is that clearer or not?
Yeah. Yes, it's clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I apologize for that again. We'll keep plugging along. So when you think about what animals have to do on islands, one of the really most obvious thing is that they really need to adjust to very variable environments. So when we think about environmental variation for many animals, we can think about things like seasonal variation. As animals go into winter, they might need to do something very different to survive compared to living in a summer or springtime environment. Similarly, environments change over time, and it's really this type of variation that animals have to adjust or be able to survive to make sure that they can persist. Now, island environments are very, very different because particularly in places like Indonesia, which is very tropical, you may not see a lot of seasonal variation. It can be in some places, but in general, compared to other areas or at higher latitudes, the variation is very, very limited. But one thing that you can say about islands is that they differ in space very dramatically. So you don't have to go very far, for example, from a big island to a small island that might only be separated by a small stretch of ocean, and the environments can be very, very different. And it's that type of spatial difference in environmental variation that is really important for animals to be able to adapt. And Komodo dragons are very good at it. And some of the ways that they'll do this is that they can really adjust to that complexity and variation in terms of resources. And I'll show a very good example in a minute. The other thing that if you live on islands and you're generally in these very small populations, one of the biggest risks that you need to face is really dealing with animals that are very similar to you in terms of their needs. So animals often have to really do a lot to avoid competition with other members of their population. So they really need to avoid intraspecific competition. The other thing about living on islands is that you really don't want to have very strong interactions with other species, whether that be diseases, whether that be competitors, whether that be with predators. You really need to make sure that when you interact with other species in island systems where you're very, very isolated, that those interactions tend to be very weak. And I guess what I'd like to do today is start out by showing an example of what I mean by the type of variation that exists on islands. So here is a picture of KOMODO National Park, and we should be familiar with that from what Achmad was talking about before. And here is a very important food item, the rooster deer, which Achmad mentioned before. But what he didn't mention was that if you go and sample or count the population numbers of these deer at different localities on these islands, you see, for example, that there is very large amounts of variation in the population size. And the main thing to note here is that if you look at the spatial scale, that the difference or the distance between islands is often not very, very large. So even that for islands that are close together, you may still get a very, very large amount of variation in very important resources that are essential to the survival of Komodo dragons. So as Achmad kind of pointed out before, one of the best things that all animals can do is adjust their body size in relation to the resources. So if you're a Komodo dragon that lives on a very small island where you don't have a lot of prey resources, then it's a very big advantage in terms of your survival to be of a very small body size. So why do they have these small body sizes? Well, part of it, once you're smaller, is clearly that it reduces the amount of energy that individuals that live on these small islands would require to survive. So simply by reducing your body size, in the case of these Komodo dragons, they're able to really deal very effectively with a major source of environmental variation, which is the difference in the availability of prey on those islands. The other thing about living on islands is, as I've already mentioned, is that they may not vary much in time, but I've said already that they can vary a lot in terms of their resources at really small spatial scales. So here we can see Rintra Island in the foreground, and over there we can see Komodo Island in the background. But even though these islands are quite close together, they can be very, very different. So how, again, should animals deal with living on islands, even though that they're very close together and they could easily swim across? How should they really think about dealing with this environmental variation? Well, one thing to do is to make sure that you don't move too far. So Komodo dragons are very interesting because, unlike many other lizards, they are very, very mobile. They actually move a very large distance in terms of walking around in their environment in their day. And what you can generally see is that when Komodo dragons are sort of middle body sizes, they move more than when they're smaller or larger. And we think they do that because these sized dragons really have to seek out and search for a lot more small types of prey than smaller dragons or bigger dragons that only eat large prey. So very big ecological differences in their movement behavior. But what is really interesting is that if you look at Komodo dragons, even though they can move a big distance on a daily basis, they never use that movement to go very far outside of the immediate area in which they live. And what I mean by that is, it's a little bit like you running around a lot within your house, but never using that running to go a long distance, to go much further away. So Komodo dragons are very mobile, but they never move very far from, I guess, where they're born. And in fact, what we know is that Komodo dragons, even when the environmental conditions can be quite difficult, they will not leave those places. And we think that really this lack of movement to other areas or other islands, for example, is really important to them because it means that they become very adapted to their local environment. By moving to a different environment, even though it might seem like the conditions are better, if there are, for example, going from a big island to a small island where there's a lot less food, then you're going to be at a very big disadvantage if you're a Komodo dragon that's come off those big islands. So even though they move around a lot, they never really use that movement to move large distances. So they have very limited dispersal, which we think, again, is a very important way that they make sure that they don't have to deal with a lot of the environmental variation in their ecology. Now, the other interesting thing about Komodo dragons is because of that body size, and Achmad talked about that, is that as they change in body size, as they go from small to large, then they eat completely different types of food. Now, you can imagine, even with your own family, if you're sitting at home and you might only have one dessert, then there will be a lot of competition. But changing or providing different types of food and eating those at specific body sizes, Komodo dragons are very good at sharing their resources in their environment. And what I mean by that is that they're very, very efficient at utilizing resources because they don't compete a lot for the same resources, because as they change body size, their diet is changing. And they tend to do that through lots of different aspects of their ecology. So not only is their diet changing with their body size, but where they use the habitat or the particular types of vegetation communities that they prefer to live in is also changing as well. So Komodo dragons are very, very good at reducing competition. And one of the advantages of reducing competition, for example, is it means that you can really get high density populations. So for Komodo dragons, one of the hardest things to do is really live on these small islands where there's not a lot of environmental space. But if Komodo dragons are very, very efficient at sharing their resources, then Komodo dragons can really pack or have very high densities of individuals living in really small areas. So this is a beautiful picture of how Komodo dragons move within a valley. But as you can see, they move a lot, but they don't go very far outside of that local area. And the other thing that you can see here is all these overlapping colors, which represent the home range area, or the area in which an individual Komodo dragon lives. Now, what you can clearly notice is that all these home ranges are overlapping, which means that all these individuals of all different sizes can really live within the same area. So they're very, very effective or very efficient at using space. Now, as we've already said, Komodo dragons are reptiles, and if they're reptiles, then they're ectotherms. And when they're ectotherms, we expect that their energy needs are much, much lower than compared to a similar size mammal, for example. So if you're a mammal or a reptile, when you eat food, what you can do with the energy from the food is very, very different. Now, if you're a mammal like this tiger, for example, and it's eating a deer here, what do you do with that energy? Well, some of that energy will go into these anabolic processes like growth, for example, but it's only a tiny little proportion. So it's really these anabolic processes from which animals derive energy to grow and reproduce. Okay, but what you notice is that if you're a mammal, the amount of energy that goes into growth or reproduction is very, very small compared to the Komodo dragon. So if a tiger and a Komodo dragon were to eat the same amount of food, the tiger would only invest or put 1% of that energy into growth and reproduction. In contrast, because the Komodo dragon is a reptile and has a very low metabolic rate, it can put a huge amount of energy into growth and reproduction, which really allows it to have much higher population densities within the same area, feeding on the same amount of food. So again, another really good example of how Komodo dragons are very, very efficient in their ecology, which helps them live on these small islands. And just to give you an example of the differences in these types of efficiency, if we compare the amount of biomass, which is really just the number of Komodo dragons multiplied by their body mass in a particular area, so say for example a square kilometre, and we look at this biomass, so the total amount of weight of Komodo dragons, and we compare it against other types of large predators around the world, then we can see Komodo dragons have a far greater biomass. So really important for allowing them to have very high density populations in very small areas within these island environments. And that's going to be very useful because one of the things that really makes animals sensitive to extinction is their population size. So predator biomass, and in particular for Komodo dragons, given that it is so very high, is going to be something that's going to be very useful to this species for living in island environments. Now, surprisingly, most of the time when we think about predators, we know that they're feeding on prey, and Achmad made mention that Komodo dragons really feed on, when they're large at least, 3 big prey animals. So the rooster deer, the water buffalo, and wild pig. Now, many other predators are able to regulate their prey populations by eating them to an extent that the population is decreased below what would be supported otherwise by the environmental conditions. However, what we find with Komodo dragons is that they have very weak predation effects on their ungulate prey. So if you change the density, and this is simply more Komodo dragons along the x-axis, as that increases along the x-axis, and we look how that density changes affects the growth rate or the population size of either rooster deer or these wild pigs, and we see that there is no relationship. It's very, very flat. Now, in many other systems around the world, when you look at the effects of large predators on their prey, as the predator density increases, then you would see a slope in the prey population growth rate decreasing, because the rate of predation will be sufficient enough to drive prey population numbers below carrying capacity. And we think this type of weak predation, for lack of a better word, is very, very important again to the ecology of Komodo dragons, because what it really does is stabilize the interactions with very key species in these environments. So if populations are not varying in their size over time, then there is a much less risk of extinction. So these are just some of the things that we think Komodo dragons do in terms of ecology to really solve the problem of living on these small islands. I would just like to acknowledge the various government organisations through which we collaborate in our research efforts. I'd also like to thank the various funding bodies that provide the very necessary money to allow Komodo Survival Program to do its very important conservation and monitoring activities. And thank you very much to everyone else out there who's listening. Thank you.